So our next presentation is from Sarah Parvanta. So Kathy sort of gave a little bit of a hint about her presentation. So Sarah will be talking about the ALS caregiving needs and the results from an ALS focus survey of current and past caregivers. So thank you.
Hello, I'm Sarah Parvanta, and I direct the ALS Focus Survey Program at the ALS Association. Today, I will present results from a recent ALS Focus survey on caregiver needs. I conducted this research with my co-authors listed here on the slide and with our ALS Focus partners. First, I'll tell you about the ALS Focus program in general, and then we'll dive into results from the Caregiver Needs survey. ALS Focus is a patient and caregiver-led program that surveys people with ALS and their caregivers to understand their experiences, needs, and preferences as they face this disease. Our team at the ALS Association works with a patient and caregiver advisory committee. Some of those members are shown here. And with them, we select survey topics, design questions, and recruit participants. We also have partners from academic universities, federal government, and industry who contribute their expertise to this program. ALS focus surveys are carried out through approved research methods, and we collect systematic data to inform ALS research, advocacy, and care. A couple of unique features are built into ALS Focus to enhance its impact. First, focus surveys take place online, so participants can take part in this ALS research from their homes. Our partners at Massachusetts General Hospital developed and maintained the online survey platform. Each participant receives a global unique identifier called a neurostamp to ensure their survey responses are anonymous. And then using this neurostamp, it's possible to combine data from focus surveys with data from other studies like the CDC registry studies and clinical trials. The de-identified focus data are free for the public and ALS researchers to use after an embargo period, and we definitely encourage others to use these data. People with ALS, current caregivers, and former caregivers are eligible to participate in ALS focus surveys, and they can go to the link shown here on the slide to read more information and to sign up. We're currently recruiting participants for a new ALS focus survey on access to mobility equipment, so it's a perfect time to join. Now that you have a sense for the aims and design of the ALS Focus program, I'll present results from the recent Focus survey on caregiver needs. Working with our Focus partners and the Patient and Caregiver Advisory Committee, we designed the Caregiver Needs survey for current and former caregivers of people with ALS. Over 600 caregivers took this online survey and answered questions on programs they use most and their key concerns as they provide care. So here's what we found. This first result shows that caregivers who took the survey dedicated a lot of their time to providing care, with 68% saying that they spend over 30 hours a week. For almost all participants, time spent providing care was equivalent to a part-time or full-time career. Next, we examined 24 types of programs and trainings for ALS caregivers. The survey asked caregivers which programs they used and their top 5 most needed programs. This slide is focused on the top 5 programs that caregivers chose. So the numbers on the right of the blue bars shown here indicate the ranking of each of the programs in terms of need, and the bars themselves are the percentage of caregivers who used each program. So I'll walk through. The most highly used and highly needed program was home visits from nurses and occupational or physical therapists, shown here at the top. Fewer caregivers said they were using trainings on general caregiving, shown lower down on this chart, but these trainings ranked second in terms of mattering to caregivers and helping them in their roles. So of all the caregivers who participated, most of them were saying that they needed these types of programs on general caregiving. The general trainings that we asked about included how to assist with transfers, daily living, and tracheotomy care. Palliative or hospice care services ranked third in terms of need, and 40% of caregivers said they used this program. Over half of caregivers used equipment loan programs, which ranked fourth. And finally, we saw a tie for fifth place, which included a need for multidisciplinary ALS clinics, caregiver support groups, and training on feeding tubes. Our Patient and Caregiver Advisory Committee said it was important to ask current caregivers how prepared they felt for the coming changes in their responsibilities as ALS progresses. The bars in red here show that just over half of current caregivers felt at least somewhat prepared for future responsibilities, but this left 46% in blue who felt unprepared for those new and changing responsibilities. We used a previously published measure of 15 types of ALS-related concerns and asked caregivers to select their top 5 concerns from the list. Most often, caregivers said a top concern was the well-being of their family and loved ones. Caregivers' other top concerns were worries about the future, time for self-care, depression, and less engagement with activities that they enjoy. And finally, using another published measure, we asked current caregivers to consider all parts of their life over the past 2 days, including physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and financial experiences, and then rate their overall quality of life from 0 to 10, with 0 being very poor and 10 being excellent. About 60% rated their quality of life as 6 or higher, shown in red. So this is on the more positive side of quality of life. But this left nearly 40% of current caregivers who rated their quality of life on the lower or less positive side of this scale. Here are some takeaways from these findings. The Caregiver Needs survey systematically focused on what ALS caregivers are going through and how best to support them going forward. Many caregivers feel unprepared for new changes as they provide ALS care. And even while caregivers are most concerned about their loved ones, they deserve the support that they need to improve their own quality of life as they care for others. This survey also quantified key ways that we can support caregivers. Home visits from healthcare professionals continue to be essential to ALS caregivers, and trainings on general caregiving should be made available and accessible as well, because as we saw, these types of trainings rank low in terms of use, but high in terms of need. The survey data contain other useful measures for delving into caregiver experiences, and some of those possibilities are listed here on the slide. So there's a lot of different ways to analyze both this Caregiver Needs survey, the data from that, and also other ALS focus surveys. As I mentioned earlier, ALS focus data are available for free after an embargo period, and so we certainly encourage more analysis. The Caregiver Needs data are available this winter, and the link to our data repository where you can download those data is listed on this slide. An infographic on these results is available on our Focus webpage. And again, the new ALS Mobility Survey is open now for both current and former caregivers and for people with ALS. So you can get to that survey from our webpage as well. ALS Focus has about 2,000 participants and counting, and the aim is to continue growing this program and creating impact through data. Here are the references mentioned in this presentation. And to close, we want to thank ALS Focus participants for being part of ALS Focus, for continuing to sign up and take surveys. And we thank our Focus Steering Committee, our partners at MGH, and our pharmaceutical industry sponsors, Apellis, Biogen, Biohaven, Cytokinetics, Ionis, and Revelesio for their contributions to Focus research. And we especially want to thank our Patient and Caregiver Advisory Committee for their work on every part of Focus since it began. I'm happy to answer questions and feel welcome to contact me at the email address listed here. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing that. What is a fantastic initiative. And I've got a couple of questions, and while I'm asking my questions, if anybody else would like to put a question into the chat or Q&A, that would be good. Thank you. I just wanted to get a sense, and I know you talked about it in your slide around the further analysis, but when you were going through, I was sort of thinking about the variability of a caregiver's journey, which is very much dependent on the stage of disease progression. And wouldn't that, in a sense, skew the results? And certainly you can't look at it at a point in time because of that deterioration.
That's an excellent question, and it's I think a consideration that we talk about a lot with our Patient and Caregiver Advisory Committee. We have some measures in our ALS Focus demographics survey about time of diagnosis. So we have a sense for how long the person is with ALS, how long they've had the disease, and also how long the caregiver has been providing care and what the stage is of the person that they're taking care of. So there are ways to analyze these data looking at that. What are the differences in needs depending on someone's stage in the journey? And these data are more general, meaning they're overall results of the full sample, but it is possible to conduct subgroup analysis to answer those kinds of questions, because you're right, there might be variability. And it makes a lot of sense to have a sense for what people's needs are, depending on if they're newly diagnosed or further along in the journey.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. All right, no, good, thank you. Got a question from Kathy. Was there anything that surprised you in the data?
I think that's a great question. Thanks, Kathy. Perhaps what surprised me the most was that I saw this difference in the need for general caregiving, that a lot of the participants said that they needed this service, but not as many people were using it, even though those kinds of programs are available. And apologies for the noise just at the moment. So I think that showed a really important disparity in terms of, or an important gap that could be filled. So maybe it's that these trainings and programs on general caregiving are available, but for whatever reason, caregivers aren't able to access that. And this is a place where I think organizations like the ALS Association and other organizations that provide those kinds of care services can identify that gap and implement those programs or communication about those programs so that more caregivers know about general caregiving opportunities and trainings for those.
Good, thank you. Another question that I had was around the data. So you mentioned data in ALS Focus is free for the public and ALS researchers. And I'm wondering why it's free when there's actually an inherent value in the data. And wouldn't you actually put a price against that inherent value?
So an inherent value in the data moving forward, in terms of we're collecting it now, but in the future, or could you?
Or even now, it would have a value.
Yes. Well, as a data scientist, I think data, we're able to use them to provide evidence that maybe reflects anecdotal information that we've heard from different caregivers and people with ALS. But when you have that a very strong level of participation, like we are growing and like we've seen in this caregiver survey for ALS Focus, you're able to generate a set of evidence that perhaps are harder to question or harder to second guess, because you have a lot of people from that population expressing an experience, need, or preference. And it's almost like a type of currency that you can pinpoint places of need and places where intervention could be useful, maybe in a more efficient way than it's maybe helping to identify those needles in haystacks. This is where we can have the greatest impact the soonest as we try to tackle all of these issues. Maybe here's a place to start and what to do after that.
Yep, that's a good point. No, thank you. Rod asks a question around converting or translating what the data is telling us into action. So how do we do that as a challenge?
Well, the ALS Association definitely considers and tries to rely on these data sets that we're now generating through ALS Focus, again, to guide and steer directions of advocacy efforts, research efforts, how to design clinical trials, as well as care services. So we try to, working with the Patient and Caregiver Advisory Committee, our goal is always to ask very actionable types of questions. It's beyond interest alone and knowledge alone. We want to have questions where if a need is apparent in these large data sets, that's a place where a direct action can be taken. So, or developed if it isn't already available. But when we develop these questions, we talk with our care services leads, our advocacy leads, our research leads to ask them what kinds of questions do they need answered for the activities that they're working on. And we hope that because of that, these types of questions will be useful for other organizations as well. So our goal is for other organizations to be able to act on the results, translate those findings into research, advocacy, and care in ways that matter to caregivers and people with ALS.
Good, excellent. All right, well, thank you, Sarah, for your great presentation and the questions. So I'll now go back to, yep, thank you. So back to Jess.